Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Oh, and Antonia's got a nice sexy voice today, as you can tell. Scratchy, sultry voice.
Every once in a while we do one of these, and I've got the head cold voice.
Well, that's okay, because actually we're not going to do most of the talking today. We're actually going to be featuring somebody else on the program, which is exciting. We want to bring this to you as a podcast listener, because we just invited our friend Dan, who's been on the show at least 4 other times, as an interview subject. He came into the studio and he spent some time with us talking about his adventures all over the world and primarily in the United States. He's he calls himself a professional adventurer. He has INFP preferences. A lot of INFPs are jealous by the lifestyle he's living. No job, a traditional job, 9-to-5 type job. And he basically full-time gets to go hiking and adventuring with his life all the time. And I think that's a pretty envious position to be in if you are, you're interested in doing that.
Well, I think he actually does have a job, but he gathers his resources and then will spend concentrated amounts of time doing one of these major hikes. So it's not like he's a trust fund kid.
No. Well, what I mean is he doesn't have like a 9-to-5 with the resume and having to clock in and clock out of an office and all that.
He's definitely figured out how to live next to society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just had him at our profiler training event, and he gave a great talk from the main stage. I think it was on Thursday night, to the entire student group that was there, both the advanced profiler training students and the new students in the 101 course. And it was an incredible talk because I think he highlighted some of the aspects of his adventures and gave some stories. It's a great storytelling talk, but it really hit home to a lot of people in the audience listening of the adventures that maybe he can inspire in them. And it was an encouragement to rise to an adventure and live life to the fullest. And I think it's a really interesting talk that we want to share with you, even though you weren't able to come to Profiler Training Live yourself. We want to share this with you as a podcast listener because we think it's very impactful and we want you to hear it.
And I really do want to highlight at the end of his talk, he talks about how important it is for us to be connected to nature. So I think it was just a really lovely talk. So without further ado.
Yeah, let's head over to the main stage from our live Profiler Training event in Orlando, Florida, where we can hear Dan talk about being the king of the wild things.
Thank you. Thanks. So, end of second day of Profiler Training Live event. How's everybody doing? Doing good? Doing good? What I'm going to share with you tonight is a story of my personal encounter with myself. And it stretches out over more than a couple days. In fact, it stretches out over the majority of my life. And when Antonia and Joel described that term to me, an encounter with the self, of course my mind's kind of going like, what is the root of that concept? And one of the things I ended up thinking about, kind of right away actually, was a book that I had as a child. It was one of the earliest books I was introduced to, a picture book. Who here remembers the book Where the Wild Things Are? I'd say we got about 2/3 to 3/4 of people remember that book. So that's fine. For those of you unfamiliar with Where the Wild Things Are, it's a children's picture book and by Maurice Sendak. And it tells us the story of Max. And Max is a little boy with very big emotions. I could relate to Max. And Max, because his emotions are kind of big, has some challenges with them. And he ends up in a little bit of a conflict with his mom and has to go to his room. And there in his room, through metaphor and fantastic imagery, what we're really seeing is Max has an encounter with himself. And by the end of the story, Max, this little boy, has actually grown quite a bit as a person. We can kind of watch him mature. But the way it plays out in the story is in his imagination, his room is transformed into this magical wilderness. And in this magical wilderness, this forest, he meets these creatures that he calls the wild things. And the wild things look like they might be kind of scary at first. They have big claws, and they have like yellow eyes and teeth. But Max understands that if he's not afraid of them, he has nothing to worry about. So he's not afraid. So Max looks right in their eyes, he looks right at their claws and their teeth, and he's fine. In fact, the wild things, not only do they not harm him, they make him their king. And so he goes on these amazing adventures in this imaginary land in his mind as king of the wild things. And as a little boy, I loved Max's story. And it still affects me to this day, actually. I loved the idea of a wild thing. Just that term just was like really stimulating to me. What's a wild thing? What is wildness? To me, wildness, like the creatures in the story of Max, in where the wild things are, wildness is nothing scary. What a wild thing is a creature that is living 100% true to its nature. It's a living thing that experiences its existence and expresses it with an authenticity that is 100% irrepressible. That's kind of what we're all aspiring to do, isn't it? We're all kind of aspiring in our own way to be a wild thing. And so I loved this story as a kid. I read it numerous times. And what was cool about my childhood is that I actually had opportunity to kind of live that out. We lived out in the sticks, up on a hillside that was largely forested. There was a lot of places for me to wander around and explore and get scraped up. There were streams, there were ravines, there was gullies, there was ponds. And from a very early age, I'm talking like 5 years old, I was given free rein to just wander. I don't know what my parents were thinking, but they probably would be arrested today for how far they let me just go. But I think it's because I have a giant family, I'm the 9th of 10 children, and they probably figured, yeah, we got a few to spare. Come back. It's fine. So I wandered, and I found wild things. And sometimes the wild things was a little praying mantis that I thought was really cool looking. And sometimes it was frogs around the pond, or I'd go down in the stream. And in the streams, I learned that if you get down and the flattish rocks, you could pull them up. And underneath them, a lot of times you'd find crayfish. And after a couple painful lessons, I learned the safe way to catch a crayfish, which was really cool. And then sometimes I'd see bigger wild things. I'd see woodchucks and deer, and rarely, but every once in a great while, a fox. These were creatures just doing what they did. They were expressing their existence with irrepressible authenticity, and I loved them. So I would explore these areas. If you went up the road from where we lived, there's just imagine a dirt country road kind of going up a hill. And up a ways, there was another dirt road that intersected it. And you wander down that a little ways, and there's a stream that cut under the bank, cut under the road. And if I scrambled down the bank, I could hop across a few rocks and get walking up the stream and go up a couple of bends. And there was a maple tree that grew right beside this stream. And every time I went out to explore, I had to go here first. This was destination one. And the reason why is the maple tree was my best friend. And so I didn't want it to have its feelings hurt. I didn't want it to be sad that its best friend wasn't showing up to say hi when he's going out to adventure. So I had to go check in with the maple tree first. And it had these two branches that were low enough that from about 5 or 6 years of age, I could jump up and get a hold of them. And I could scramble up in the tree. And they came together in such a way that it was a really comfortable place for me to sit. And so I would sit there in the limbs of the maple tree, and I decided that this was my throne. Because I had decided that, like Max, I was king of the wild things. So I would check in with the maple. How is the kingdom doing? How are all the wild things getting along? Make sure everything's good. And then I had to get down and personally oversee the kingdom. And that looked like me checking out all the things living in the stream, looking what's going on in the tree, and every time kind of going a little further than I did last time. Following the stream this way a little bit more, following the stream that way a little bit more, going up that hill a little further, because I knew that every time I did that, if I went just a little further, there was going to be something awesome. And I was right 100% of the time. There was always something awesome if I just went a little bit further. So it occurred to me one day that I could just keep doing this. I could just keep going a little further and a little further, and I could explore the whole world this way. Just checking it out, one little rock, stream, and hill at a time, walking around, seeing what wild things are there. That sounded amazing to me. The advantage I had in addition to being in a place where I was exposed to this, was I was going to live forever. And when I say I was going to live forever, I don't mean that in the sense that children typically don't have a great sense of their own mortality. It just so happens that I was raised in a religion that taught me from a very early age that in a literal biological sense, I was never going to die. And I believed that. And we would have family Bible study, and the discussion came up regularly. What do you want to do when you live forever? Because what I was led to believe was that before I got a chance to grow old, in fact, probably before I even got out of high school, God was going to turn his attention to the earth and fix everything, and all the good people would get to live forever. The ultimate in abundance. And so my large family had a lot of different ideas of what they wanted to do when they lived forever. And they would talk about, well, I want to have a really nice farm up in the mountains, and there's going to be a waterfall, and I want to raise horses, and I want to have a whole bunch of kids. I want to learn to play every instrument that's ever been invented, every musical instrument. I want to learn to paint, whatever it was. And every time I was asked, what do you want to do when you live forever? I said, I want to explore the world on foot. It was the only thing that made sense to me to do with a life that I couldn't imagine ending. I wanted to explore literally every square foot of this planet, one step at a time. That seemed like the ultimate way that I could express my existence with 100% authenticity that was irrepressible. It was just completely natural. I couldn't imagine wanting to do anything else. And I got some pushback, and they would say, well, that's not really how God's plan works. You're going to have work you have to do, an assignment. But I couldn't imagine anything else that made sense to me. So that's what I had in my mind, and that's what I believed. And as time went on, I'm sad to have to say that I lost my connection with that beautiful experience of being in nature and connecting with the wild things. Life changes, and things happen, and you make decisions, as everyone does. And I found myself living in large cities. My time in nature was rare, few and far between moments, and frankly, pretty poor quality. I was stressed out. I was exhausted, and I just wasn't really getting much good out of the rare time I did get in those sort of situations. But the challenges of life did what I think they've done for a lot of you, and that is they made you grow. They made you reconsider. Your perspective grew, and it changed. And it came about at one day that the faith I had been given as a child broke. It just didn't make sense to me anymore. Before I go any further, I just want to make very clear that in this story, I am not in any way attacking or challenging anyone's faith. It just so happens that what was handed to me was just not right for me. That's all it is. But my faith broke, and I realized that everything I'd ever believed in my life up to this point was wrong. By the way, this was not something that I came about at 18, 20 years old. I was well into my 30s when I finally realized this. So I lost everything I'd ever believed in. I'd lost my concept of how life should be lived out. I lost most of my friends and family. And I lost eternity. I had thought my life was going to go on for as far as I could possibly imagine and way beyond, and now it was this long, a handful of decades, that I had never figured out how I wanted to manage. Because it wasn't going to be necessary. It was just going to get fixed. So I had a little bit of an issue. So I'm like, I got to think about how I want to live my life. I don't know what makes sense. Well, I got to take care of my future. I need to use some practical wisdom here. So like, I got to think about that. So I leaned into my career, and that went quite well. I got better and better jobs, more and more pay, better companies, ended up in a position where I had a great salary with nothing but room up, great benefits, clear path to a comfortable retirement, and all I had to do was stay the course. And it came about one day that I realized I don't believe in any of this either. In fact, I hate it. I loathe every second. And the idea of spending the majority of the remaining best years of my life doing something I hate just so I could have comfort in an old age that I'd only begun to comprehend that I would ever actually experience, it just didn't make any sense to me. So I gave up the great career, and I gave up the nice house and the nice neighborhood, and I reevaluated, and I thought that, well, while my concept of how long my life was lived was clearly not right, I think when it came to what to do with the life I have, I was right the first time. I need to explore this world on foot, one step at a time, mile after mile after mile, because that's the authentic expression of my nature. So I started doing that in small ways at first, some backpacking trips and day hikes and things, mostly in Alaska, which is a fantastic place to start that. And then I decided to get serious. I'm going to really set about exploring this world on foot. So I made my way to Maine and to Baxter State Park, and there I climbed Mount Katahdin. And the top of Mount Katahdin, I touched the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, and then I started walking south, with the intent of walking the entire distance of the Appalachian Trail. Let's move forward 6 months. I have now hiked through Maine, New Hampshire, and I'm in Vermont. And the day is coming to an end. The sun is set behind the Green Mountains, and I'm walking through a very nice, dense forest. My experience at that moment was that every joint in my body felt like it was about to snap. My pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds hanging on my back. I was incredibly hot. It was late summer. I was miserable. I was sweaty and dirty. I wanted the day to be over. I wanted the hike to be over. And I'm asking myself, why am I even out here doing this? I am absolutely miserable. And so I was going to make the last mile or so to where I was going to camp that night and just sort of reassess. But I came around a bend, and there was a tree that had fallen down over the trail, but high enough you could just walk under it. And sitting on this tree, perched on it, was a large, gorgeous owl. And as soon as it saw me, it took off, which made me even more grumpy, because I was like, I didn't have my camera ready. It was an amazing owl, and of course I don't get a shot because I'm too stupid to have my camera ready when I'm carrying a stupid camera and stupid pack, everything's stupid. It didn't react well. But if you've ever been in a forest at dusk, sometimes there's interesting things happen where the wind just completely dies out. And it gets really, really quiet. I mean, a quiet that most people have never experienced in their life. And because of that, as that owl took off, I could hear the wind whooshing over its feathers as it flew through the forest, even though I couldn't see where it went. I could literally hear where the owl was going. And I thought, I don't think it went that far. So I'm like, all right, well, I'll take a shot. So I get my camera ready, and I tiptoe under the down tree and around the corner. And sure enough, a long ways off, sitting in a tree with its back to me is this owl. I'm like, well, it's not going to be a great picture, but it's cool to see an owl, so I'll just at least snap a shot. So I pull up the camera, and I take a shot, and because it's so quiet, the owl hears me. And so it turns and looks at me. I'm like, oh, well, at least I'm getting its face. That's pretty cool, even though it's like going to be really tiny, like way off in the distance. I take another picture, and the owl lifts its wings and takes off, and for a moment I think, well, that's it, it's gone. But to my surprise, it actually flew back toward me about half the distance between us, and it landed in a tree and looked at me. I'm like, wow, that's not bad. I mean, this is kind of a decent shot I can get here, I think. And I snap another picture or two. Past the owl, a couple dozen yards, a squirrel ran down a tree. And the owl turned and looked at the squirrel, and it turned and looked at me. And I took another picture, and then it took off, and it flew and landed in a tree right over my head. And it sat there and looked at me. And then the owl started to talk. No, I'm kidding, it didn't start talking. This is not where this is going. But it did communicate in a way, I think. It started acting incredibly curious. And it started doing this. it was totally like it was just fascinated with me, like it was saying, what's that thing you're clicking? Why are you walking through the forest? Don't you know it's easier to fly? I imagine that's what an owl would think. And I am just amazed. I can't believe this is happening. Like, why is this owl so interested in me, acting completely unafraid? So I'm taking pictures, and I'm talking to it, and having this amazing experience that lasts for about a half an hour. It's just me and this owl. No one else came by in that entire time, even though the Appalachian Trail is kind of a place that can get pretty crowded. It was just me and the owl. And eventually I thought, well, I should get going because it's going to get dark, and I'd rather not hike at night if I can avoid it. So I say farewell to the owl, and I start walking, and I get a few dozen paces, and the owl leaves the branch where it had been perched and lands again in the branch right over my head. And I was absolutely amazed. And at this point, I'm in tears. I'm so moved by this experience that it's just waterworks. I can't believe that this owl is that interested in me and that it wants to spend any time with me. So I talk with it a little more, but I got to get going. Walk a little further, the owl follows me again. And it did this 3 times before it decided it was time to leave, and it flew off to go do owl stuff. And I made my way to my camp that night, and as I walked away from my last moments with that owl, my joints felt like they had been replaced with bionic titanium implants, and my pack felt like it was full of helium. And it occurred to me that the question I'd had just moments before I met the owl of why am I even out here had just gotten answered. And the answer was, this is where I belong. I am back with the wild things.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
The famous naturalist John Muir has a quote that people in the hiking community love this quote. And it's interesting because he talks about how much he hates the word hiking. But he talks about traveling through wilderness places and in nature, and he says he doesn't like the word hiking. He suggests rather to use the word saunter. We should saunter through a forest. We should saunter through a wilderness. And he ties it to an etymology of the word saunter that relates to pilgrims walking reverently through a holy land. And as these thoughts settled on me as I'm walking the last little bit of daylight out to get to my camp spot, I thought, yeah, this is sacred ground. I am a pilgrim walking through a holy land. And then it occurred to me that I had regained something I had lost. I had regained spirituality. So I couldn't stop there, so I kept walking south, and I walked all the way to Georgia. 2,200 roughly miles. It took me a little over 5 months. And at the end of that, it felt like a kind of an okay start, but that's a long way from exploring the entire world on foot. So then, a couple of years later, after a bunch of other smaller adventures, I made my way to the Mexico border in California, and I walked from Mexico to Canada through the Pacific Crest chain of mountains, 2,653-ish miles. And that was done. That didn't seem like enough. So the following year, I once again went to the Mexico border, and this time I hiked all the way to Canada through New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, ending in Glacier National Park at the Canadian border, a journey of something 3,000 plus miles, I'm not exactly sure. All totaled about a little ways north of 8,000 miles of walking. And one thing occurred to me that was pretty cool. Like, okay, I haven't explored the entire world on foot, but I have hit a milestone that fits in that, and that is 8,000 miles is actually a little more than the diameter of our world. Well, that's pretty cool. That's a good start. Now that's a good start. I walked more than the diameter of Earth on those adventures. And I did it largely as a pilgrim sauntering through a holy land. And when I say largely, I want to be clear that that tough day in Vermont was by no means the last tough day I had. There were a lot of tough days, a lot of really bad days. I had a number of injuries. I had shin splints, I had pulled muscles, I had sprains, microfractures, frostbite. I had near-death experiences that I lost count of, including such delightful things as nearly drowning, avalanche, dehydration, nearly froze to death several times. Lightning almost took me out 2 or 3 times, including once at the top of a mountain in a thunder blizzard. Did you know those were real? The only thing you need to know about a thunder blizzard is that they're fucking terrifying. Every time one of those really bad days would happen, I would go back to that thought. Why am I out here? I can quit. No one's holding a gun to my head. I can go back to the safety of civilization, and it'll be fine. And no one's even going to judge me. Like, I kind of already proved I can walk a ways, right? But I couldn't make myself quit. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is because I had taken on the role of being a pilgrim on a mission. And this was my holy land. This was my sacred ground. And my mission is to remind everyone else of how important that connection was. Because remember, I had lost it. I lost that connection. And it took me a long time to regain it. And I realized in the regaining it what I had lost and how important it was. And I'm not telling you that everybody should go hike a few thousand miles. But I will say that I absolutely believe that every one of us need to reestablish that connection with nature. It's a little different than the type of stuff we're talking about here. But when you're thinking about being a healthy version of yourself, growing as a person, that disconnect from the wellspring of our existence, from the very air we breathe, the water we drink, it's killing us. So we all need to reconnect and to feel a real connection with nature on a level that works for us. We all need it. You got to camp. How wonderful was that for something you didn't expect to happen? You need that. You need to get out there in some way and enjoy nature. Whatever works for you, you need to. You need to be out there with the wild things. Trust me, they won't hurt you. So the other reason I couldn't make myself quit, I came to realize, is that another thing that I got right the first time, a thing I understood about myself as a child that was still true, is that, damn it, I'm king of the wild things. King of the wild things don't quit. So I have to stay out here. And so I did. And there were tough days. But you know what I learned pretty quickly? There seemed to be a pattern. And that is every time I had a really terrible day, it was followed by an experience that was so beautiful, so profoundly uplifting, that I can't imagine any reason I would want to miss that. There is no number of bad days that would make it not worth experiencing some of these things. Now, you could say maybe it was the universe or some divine greater than me force that was rewarding my perseverance. And that could be true. But I also kind of think I was setting myself up for an inevitable experience of awesomeness. Interesting thing happens when you're on a long adventure like that. So let me give you an example. Like this week is an absolute highlight, I think I can safely say, for every one of us. It's going to be a high point that we will remember for the rest of our lives. It's probably going to change our lives. And I can also probably safe to say that every person in this room has had some really terrible lows. You've had points when you just didn't feel like you could even. Maybe you've lost someone you love. You've had a dream feel like it was crushed. Whatever it was, you've had your low days. You're going to remember those too. You are. But you know what you're not going to remember? Time a couple weeks ago, you were waiting in line at the post office, annoyed that other people existed and got there in front of you, and so you're distracting yourself on your phone to kill time. That's what I call meh. Meh is what sucks away lifetime. Some of it we can't avoid, but the cool thing about going on a big adventure is it tends to just filter out the meh. So when I had a really bad low and I'm coming up from that, there was no meh to land at. It was just going to go to something epic. And if you plot your life in a timeline, imagine a chart. Maybe this helps some of you, I don't know. But imagine a chart with your life, and you've got some pretty good days. You had a good day at work, and and then things are just kind of normal. And then maybe you have a great experience. It's birth of your child, or you find the love of your life, or a new job that is exactly what you were hoping for. That's a really great high. And then there's a bunch of that, and then you have something that's pretty low, pretty rough. And when you look back on that, what you see is the lows and the highs. You kind of don't really think much about all the meh in between. That's not really, for the most part, what impacts us and builds up what we feel like is living when we kind of catalog our lives. At least that's my experience. So what I came to call it is life compressed, because it takes out all the meh in the middle, and it's tough lows, but the epic highs that follow them immediately make me feel like in that span of time, I'm doing way more living than I would in decades and decades, maybe hundreds of years of meh. So, is it always easy? No, it is very difficult. But that idea of life compressed made me realize something else. I hadn't regained eternity, but I had figured out a way to get a lot more life out of the years I have. Let me give you an example of this. I was in the Rocky Mountains in northern Montana, and it was early October. Winter had come in early with kind of a bang, and the weather looked like it was going to improve, so I headed up into the mountains to continue my hike. And some of you may have heard this story, but it's a hell of a story, so you'll enjoy it again. And things went badly. I'll kind of truncate it a little bit. I found myself in a bad weather change condition, and freezing fog came in. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Ice was building up all over everything, including on my kilt, and it was ripping the skin off of my knees and hamstrings, and I have pictures to prove that. And my feet were getting frozen. Ice was building up on them. In fact, I started to lose feeling in my feet. So I'm scared. In fact, I'm terrified. I'm stuck at the top of this mountain peak, and I don't know how I'm going to get off of here. And it was one of those, this may be it moments. But I did manage to make my way down back into the trees and re-caught up with the trail. I sort of slid and jostled my way down the side of this ridge and got to the trail, and I had been pushing myself way past the point of exhaustion because I knew if I stopped, it probably would mean I would never move again. That's how serious it was. But I did risk a few seconds to catch my breath when I regained the trail, cut into the side of the mountain in this forest. And I took a look at my phone, had a map on there, and I realized that about a quarter of a mile up, the trail switched back. And I thought, because of my experience, I'm like, well, there's usually, even in steep terrain, there's usually a little bit of a flat spot at a switchback. Maybe it's big enough I can set my tent up, get out of these frozen clothes, and possibly survive, and maybe even not have to have my feet amputated. Because that was what I thought is the second most likely possibility if I didn't die. So I started walking in knee-deep snow toward that point, and I took a step, and while I couldn't feel anything in my foot, a sharp jolt of pain shot up through my ankle all the way up through my leg. I went, what did I just do? But I can't see anything because it's knee-deep snow and I can't feel anything in my foot. Completely lost feeling at that point. And I take another step, and the same thing happens with the other foot. Like, what is going on? There must be a bunch of logs down there or rocks or something, and I'm rolling my ankles. So I brace myself against my trekking poles, and I pull my foot up out of the snow, and as I do, I see that my foot is curled like this. And I'm like, oh, I've rolled my ankle. I'm gonna need to stretch that out. Gonna need to roll it out. Okay, ankle, roll out. Ankle, I need you to roll out. Ankle, I really need you to roll out. And my foot and my ankle had no interest in doing anything that I was telling them to do. And then I was back to being terrified because the parts of my body that I was counting on to survive, I could no longer communicate with. And the only thing I could think to do was I pushed my foot into the top of the snow and leveraged my leg against it until my foot straightened out and worked it down into the snow until I felt I was stable. And then I pulled the other foot out and I repeated that process for a quarter of a mile until I got to the camp spot that I had hoped would be there. And there was just enough flat ground for me to do the most half-assed tent setup in the history of half-assed tent setups. And I sat down in the mouth of it, but before I did that, I started melting snow in my camp stove. I didn't have any water with me because that had run out. I started melting snow in my camp stove, and I wanted to bring it to a boil with the idea that I could put it in a hot water bottle that I had and put it inside my sleeping bag and warm myself up. That was going on while I was getting the tent set up, and I sit down in the entrance of the tent, and I'm trying to take off my frozen clothes, and I go to pull the shoes off of my feet, and I cannot remove them. They are completely frozen to my feet. And I'm like, I have to get these shoes off because this will absolutely take my foot if it's frozen all night. I have to get this frozen shoes off. So the only thing I could think to do was take the water that was now boiling and pour boiling water on my feet, which I expected to be excruciatingly painful. Turns out, didn't hurt at all. And it was just enough, with basically like the last ounce of my strength, I was able to rip my shoes off. The socks were still frozen inside them. It pulled them right off of my feet. And I was able to get more hot water going and warm up, and I survived. And I didn't lose my feet, just some frostbite and nerve damage. The very next day, I met a group of people who were researching golden eagles in the Rocky Mountains. Probably not hard for you to guess from what you know of me at this point that I think this is pretty cool. And they invited me to come to their research site and see what they did. And so I did. And as it turned out, they placed a live, wild golden eagle in my arms and gave me the opportunity to release it back into that amazing holy land that I was a pilgrim in. And I was told that the golden eagle might panic a little bit when it was time to let it go. I was expecting that. But it didn't. It totally relaxed in my arms and just looked up at me. I think it knew I was king of the wild things, right? It must know at this point. And so I took one sauntering step forward and released this magnificent, amazing wild thing out to soar out across the Rocky Mountains. And I just watched it go. And I knew, because I was told this is a hatchier bird, that bird is going to be there 40 years from now, soaring in those mountains. One of the questions people ask me when they hear about my adventures is, do I get scared? Most of the time I'm not scared, but sometimes, yeah. Sometimes I'm terrified. But I think the implication behind the question is that if you've never spent time in the wilderness, just the idea of going up there comes with the idea that I could die in the mountains. I've thought about this. Somewhere in 8,000 miles of walking and exploring this world one step at a time, 16 million times placing my foot on this planet in a place I have never been before. Somewhere in there, I realized I'm okay with dying in the mountains. Now, don't get me wrong. I want it to be a long time from now. Like, I'm not in any hurry to die in the mountains. I want to be 100 and whatever, and have hiked every trail I can imagine, and seen all of the amazing wild things, and met incredible human beings along the way, and shared journeys with them. And, you know, I've got all wizened, I got a beard down to here, and still rocking a kilt. I'll leave you that image, thank you, you're welcome. And then if it's my time to go, that's the place that seems right for me. That's where I belong. That's where the authentic, irrepressible expression of my existence seems fitting to come to its conclusion. And the fact is, I don't know the answers. I don't know if maybe I will get more than this life. Maybe there's a spirit in me that will go out of my body after I die. That would be cool. And if it happens in that place, I'm cool with that. Let it go free. Let it just go saunter with all those amazing wild things.
So you can see why we wanted to share this talk with you today. I think it's an inspiring message. And at the end of the talk, Dan got mobbed by a bunch of people who were like, this is awesome, man. How do I join you for adventures? How do I bring more of the elements of nature and the outdoors into my own life? And I think this idea of life living on a compressed timeline is something else that I really took from it that spoke to me. You know, we live through our lives. We remember the highs and the lows like Dan talked about. And an outdoor adventure can compress that on a really small timeline to start to see those highs and lows right next to each other. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. There was actually a quote you used to quote it all the time, Joel. It was, don't measure your life in hours, measure it in breaths.
I think it's a ancient wisdom from China or some other country in Southeast Asia that had this common wisdom. Yeah, it was like, don't measuring your life in breaths. There's going to be a certain amount of breaths that you take in your lifetime. And after you take that many breaths, your life's over.
Right. And it was it's like an encouragement to slow your breathing down and be more present. And I've always thought that was a really interesting statement. But this idea of not measuring it in days, but in highs and lows, because I think that is actually a big part of how we experience life. I completely understand why the concept of having lots of highs and lows quickly is like a compressed version. And I think we have a tendency to shy away from highs and lows, almost like because we're humans, right? We want homeostasis. That's the thing that makes us feel the best, is when everything's just real samesies and real predictable straight line. And yet that's not much of a life. Like the highs and lows are really what we tap into. And so I like this idea of being able to compress things. And even if you can't do that all the time, I don't actually think that it's good for us to sustain constant perpetual highs and lows. But when we put ourselves in an opportunity to experience that and put ourselves in a place where we can have that for a time, I think it actually does create a lot of richness out of life. So I very much appreciated this talk too.
Yeah. So what did you think? You were here listening along with us to Dan's presentation from Profiler Training, a very recent talk he gave. What's coming up for you? Are you getting excited about doing some adventures of your own? What do you think about this idea of life compressed, the highs and the lows in a compressed way when you do something extreme like an outdoor adventure? Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Share your question, your comment, or more importantly, we want to hear your story. Maybe you've got a great story about your own adventure you've been on, and maybe some of the challenges that was or the learning you got from it. That could be awesome for the rest of the community to hear from you and what you have to say. So you haven't had a third mic here in this conversation with me and Antonia, but we do want to hear from you. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard. Should I go easy on you and not let you have to talk and kill your voice?
I was just about to launch into it. I didn't even think about it.
You're like all scratchy and stuff.
Let me see if I can do it.
Sure.
All right. The listener will have to deal with my my scratchy voice. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. I read everyone, so please go. If you have been listening to this podcast for a while, I don't know, weeks, months, years, maybe even, and
Decades.
Almost. Soon it will be a decade, but not quite yet. But if you've listened to us for a long time and appreciated the podcast, if you'd come over and leave us a rating and a review, I would be very grateful. We also have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. Go see if there's one right for you at personalityhacker.com. You look at the catalog or the product catalog and see which one is right for you at this time period in your life. We have programs around emotional management, body-mind practices, and basic personal development that is tailored to you and your personality type. So go check it out at personalityhacker.com.
I also want to draw attention to the fact that Dan gave this talk on the main stage at our Profiler training program. And if this is something that you are interested in, we'd love to invite you to check out more information about Profiler training, because it's an amazing 6-month course at the time of this recording that culminates in 5 days of live experience. So we do a lot of training around the system for 6 months, preparing for 5 days of connecting the learning into real-world application, the ability for you to sit down across from another human being and have a conversation for about an hour and help them determine their best fit personality type. It is a skill that keeps on giving. Many of our students say that this is something that has changed their life, understanding and learning this skill set. So I want to invite you to check out more if that's something that's interesting to you. And maybe next time Dan or someone else gives a talk from the main stage at our Profiler training program, you could be there live with us. I think that would be really cool. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.